I think it's safe to say that our two keynote speakers here need no introduction. That doesn't mean we won't necessarily try to introduce them. We are so privileged to have two leading lights who, I guess I'll have to second what Kathy Brown said, are very much models in trying to spur the level of discourse that we'd like to always see at the FCC. And they are both, thankfully, stayed involved in the world of communications policy. And we want to make this as interactive as possible. So if people can start submitting their questions now, feel free to do that. And we'll once again collect your questions. So we'll have Gigi and I both co-moderate. I'll let Gigi take the first whack at it. You guys sit up here.
Well, I've got Bill here and Reed here, but it doesn't matter. And I'd like you to come up to the podium after we ask our questions. So let me give you a little, we've now been here since about 9, and we've got a whole lot of ideas for reforming the agency. So let me tick off about a dozen. The FCC needs to be more data-driven, needs to promote innovation, should be reorganized into functions, getting out of the silos, and should have task forces so the different bureaus talk to each other. Should have personnel that promotes the public interest, and we need more diverse expertise, economic, technological, female, minorities. We need an FCC that listens and learns, particularly from academics. There needs to be more academic input. We need an FCC that develops, empowers, and manages staff better, actually letting staff have a role in decision-making. We need greater transparency and public input, and perhaps we need to reform the Sunshine Act. The FCC needs to have more strategic planning and better pronouncement of its policy goals. The FCC needs to restore procedural fairness, particularly when it comes to ex parte rules, when it comes to actually issuing notice of proposed rulemaking that propose rules as opposed to looking like notices of inquiry. We need to dispense with ideological approaches. The commissioners need to have more power, and it shouldn't be the imperial chairman. We need to have more of a role for adjudication. And some would say, I don't think this is universal, we need more congressional direction, so more congressional hands-on, hands-off. So these are just some of the things that were discussed today. So my question to you is, what do you like, what don't you like, how would you reform the agency? And focusing more on the future and less on the past.
Since you preceded me in office, perhaps you should precede me now.
Do you guys want to get up?
I think the FCC needs a new chairman. Every now and then. There's a lot of, it's actually pretty hard to disagree with those ideas. Let me just say what I think is the situation for whatever it's worth. I think the important thing about the communications sector is to take a fresh look at its relationship to the domestic economy and to the global economy. The situation is quite radically different than it was in the salad days of the internet in 1993, when after only an 8-month delay I was confirmed. I hope that the current chairman has a faster trip between nomination, or the to-be chairman has a faster trip between nomination and confirmation. It was really easy for Bill, I might add. Sooner or later, there will be a new chairman, and I think that the important thing is to think about the differences between these eras. And I think that there are basically in our relevant memory here 3 different time periods. There's the time periods of the 90s, when for Bill and for me and for all the folks that worked with us, many of whom I'm so happy to see here, the reality is that there was a continually increasing demand for all these packets. That demand pulled a tremendous amount of investment into the sector. Frankly, it was pretty hard for us to even get in the way of it. It was more important that we contribute our views and our thoughts about the structure of the industry and about the general direction, but less important that we worry about creating the demand itself. From 1997 to 2007, that runs right through the dot-com stock market bubble and bust. For those 10 years, $850 billion was invested in networks in the United States. $850 billion of investment. That's the largest single surge of private investment in any sector in the country in the last 30 years. This happened for a whole bunch of reasons. I see Joe over here, and he could tell us, if we gave him any airtime, which we're not, that cable put in about $95 to $105 billion in roughly that same time period. Probably started a little bit early because of the reaction to the Cable Act, but roughly in that same time period. And if you went sector by sector, you would say, you know, this is what the Bells did, this is what the long-haul carriers did, this is what the wireless guys did. And what you would see sector by sector are the following basic features. In that time period, sector by sector, almost every industry moved into an adjacent market. Almost everybody moved into internet service provision. Many companies moved into content. That's a big part of the CapEx on the telco side. And almost every company, and maybe everyone in some way, went from wire to wireless. In the case of Sprint, pretty much abandoning the wire, but in the case of most, adding a whole new dimension to their corporate activities. So these are moves into adjacent markets, they're moves into new markets, and they are moves that were fueled by this tremendous CapEx. And of course, it was all about meeting new kinds of demand, so that all Americans in that time period purchased more of the same things and also a whole bunch of new things. So that if you looked at the share of the wallet for all consumers in the 10-year period I'm describing, the share of the wallet allocated to information and communications technology or to technology, media, and telecom, or whatever category you want to describe, that went up. An interesting reflection of that is that the single biggest driver of electricity use in the home today is in consumer electronics, because these consumer electronics that have been added to the home in significant part are also communications devices. And so they are intensive users of electricity. And in the business sector of the economy, the single biggest driver of electricity use is data centers, a category that did not exist for all relevant purposes 10 years ago. And data centers consume 1.5% of all the electricity in the United States today. So these are fantastic stories about demand growth and new technological ways of supplying that demand growth. And Bill has been investing in these companies for the last 8 years, and so have many, many others in the United States. Mostly what I've been doing for the last 10 years is working in startups and in tech company boards that have been trying to meet this demand with these new technologies. So this is the kind of story that America is looking for somewhere. The reason why the financial services bust was certain to occur, and if I had known the timing, I surely would have told you, but the reason that it was certain to occur is that the market cap of the financial services sector and their share of the profits of corporate America, those two things, their share of total market cap and their share of profits, were both extraordinarily and abnormally and unsustainably high. I think in terms of profits in 2007 and 2008, it was something like 40% of all corporate profits were in the financial services. It's unsustainably high. As an economy like a portfolio does need asset reallocation, and we've suffered a extremely grievous and serious version of it, and one that arguably we should have been more guarded against, but it was certain to occur. The same thing happened with respect to the dot-com bubble, where the market cap and the share of profits in the TMT sector became abnormally high. But the big difference is this. We were investing in ICT in real assets, non-residential fixed assets, that are almost without exception being used today. the so-called overinvestment in long-haul fiber is the reason why you can watch YouTube like that. And that is a big difference between that phenomenon and what we've seen in the financial services sector, where there was no corollary fundamental investment in non-residential fixed assets. So therefore what? The situation for the FCC, to my way of thinking, is what role can it play in revitalizing investment in non-residential fixed assets in America? People have to step up to that role. Companies do, sectors do. The president-elect is well aware of this. His whole team is well aware of it. It is the big thing that we have to do as a country. We have to have not just a manufacturing base, but a services base that is built on increased investment in non-residential fixed assets. The Fortune 500 today have $650 billion of cash on their balance sheets. $650 billion of cash. It's just a coincidence, but it's roughly the same as the TARP amount of money. So this is not quite logical, but it is metaphorically worth noting. So the Treasury had to step in to get authority to spend $700 billion for the financial sector, while the Fortune 500 companies had the same amount of money on their balance sheet and couldn't find anything to invest in. So that's not right. I'm not saying we shouldn't save the financial services sector. Of course we should. We should save that. We should save Social Security. We should have universal health care. These are essentials. But we have to have it be the case that in our economy, our companies see things to invest in, and we want those things to be in this country. We don't want them to only be in this country. Only 4% of all of our firms export, only 4%. We need to be more committed, not less committed, to export. But the fundamental export product in America is going to be a technology product. So that investment that we're going to want to make in non-residential fixed assets is going to be, because this is what we do best, it's going to be in the high end, it is going to be in tech, and it is going to create the kind of innovations and advances in our companies in our domestic sector that in turn are going to let those companies be leaders in increasing our export capability. So this is potentially an unbelievably exciting time period, because I think we've rounded a corner. We hope that we've also hit a bottom in terms of the downturn, but we've rounded a corner in the way that we think about our country. We're not in the early innings of the internet. It is the fundamental platform for communication. We are now in an era where you assume that as you design consumer electronics and the energy sector's grid and everything else in the economy, and then you try to build from that. So the question for the FCC, and I certainly, I'm confident that we'll have a chair and commissioners and staff and all the able people you're talking about who will be up to meeting this question. But to me, the question is the important thing to frame right. I think the question is, how do we get this investment going? What does it look like? What is the market structure that will encourage it? You are not going to be able to have a regulation that mandates it. You're going to have opportunities opened, and the regulatory activity will play a role in opening those opportunities. But we need to bring an end to the era of consolidation, shrinkage, deleverage, cash hoarding, and the withdrawal from new markets. We need to bring an end to that for the good of the whole country. And we need to make sure that what I'm talking about is a very hard thing to do. We need to be aware that it's a very hard thing to do when the executives of our companies are under a tremendous pressure to keep their dividends going, to keep their people on the payroll. We need to be acutely aware that you can't just say these things and then say, well, it's certain to happen. You have to really look at market structure and market opportunities in a way that is going to make it irresistible for firms to rise to this challenge, because only when they do, little ones and big ones, incumbents and startups and new entrants, only when they do will we really be able to say that the ICT sector has contributed to the future of our country in the way that we so importantly need to have happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Reed. That was great. It reminded me of my confirmation hearing in the Senate when John McCain asked me the question that everybody seized on, saying Kennard flubbed that question, because he asked me, well, is there anything that you disagree with Reed Hundt on, your predecessor? And I said, no. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Gigi, I was writing down the issues that you ticked off, and I think it's a great set of issues for all of us who care about the FCC to think about as we chart the future of the agency. But I would just step back and marvel at what a great opportunity the next FCC will have, the next chair will have, because that person will come into the job being named by a president who really lives and loves technology. We all followed the campaign, and we saw how the Obama campaign really revolutionized the use of technology in politics. People will be writing about it for generations. And it wasn't just about fundraising and all the incredible numbers that were produced over the internet fundraising machine, but it was really about harnessing the power of social networking to bring people together to support a political movement. And so President-elect Obama will take office with an administration sort of infused and motivated with this wonderful appreciation for how technology can change the country and move the country forward. And that provides a huge opportunity for the FCC to do what Reed was suggesting, is sort of come out of its shell. We have been living in an incredible period in technology in the last 20, 25 years, where we've seen the birth of all these wonderful technologies, from wireless to the internet. And now we have an opportunity to harness that technology and apply it to solve some of the more vexing problems we face as a country. And Senator Obama, now President-elect Obama, talked about this in the campaign, about using technology to address energy independence issues, or using it to solve our difficult healthcare challenges, digitizing healthcare records, and of course, using technology to help lift this economy back up. It's not too dissimilar to the time when Reed became chair. I remember we were in a recession then. It wasn't nearly as severe as what we're facing now, but I'll never forget Reed called all of us in to his office. I was general counsel at the time. And he said, I want all of us to think about how we can be an engine of job creation at the FCC. And I want every order, I'm sure some people remember this, Pepper and Linda and others, I want every order to talk about how we can help create jobs. And a lot of people were scratching their heads, how am I going to write a tariff order to create jobs, you know? But it was changing the culture of the agency. And we have that opportunity again, for the agency to think broadly about how it can apply its talents to solve really big issues that face the country. The FCC can do this, but it has to, again, get out of its shell. It has to start forming relationships with other areas of government, people who are creating the databases of information that the FCC could tap in to help drive its decision-making, working with the healthcare agencies and the energy department, the labor department. It's a big challenge. It's an exciting challenge for the agency. To the sort of some of the more mundane issues that have been mentioned and talked about, sort of agency reorganization and what the FCC looks like, I think we have to be careful about, and I think somebody said it earlier, about just thinking that we can solve problems by reorganizing boxes on the chart. Certainly the FCC is siloed. It's siloed around technology. That's got to change. We've known that for a long time. Kathy Brown and I wrote a blueprint for an FCC for the 21st century that talked a lot about how we needed to reorganize the agency. And we got it started with an enforcement bureau and a consumer bureau, but much of that needs to be finished. But I think that first and foremost, before you even begin that process, the agency needs to sit down collectively, and that, I mean, commissioners, staff at all levels, and really think deeply about what is the right market structure for the industry. And frankly, in retrospect, I wish I had done that. When I took on the chairmanship of the agency, so much of it was driven, our agenda was so much driven by the 96 Telecom Act, which we were still implementing. And Congress had sort of usurped the agency's agenda in a lot of fundamental ways and given us this huge workload of rulemakings. And so we just put our head down and did it. But in retrospect, I wish I had, and I would certainly advise the next chair, to sit down and think deeply about what should the market structure for the industry look like? Because how do you have a national broadband policy for the country without addressing that fundamental question? What is the market structure going to look like? How many broadband providers can we have? And how do we, obviously the more is better, and how do we utilize the tools the agency has, particularly the spectrum, to make sure that we have more rather than few? And just looking back at my tenure again, by not doing that, what we faced was a wave of mergers. And the agency really didn't have a framework within which to decide those mergers. So as a result, we tried to deal with a lot of what we perceived as market imbalances or distortions those mergers would create by imposing conditions. In retrospect, that was the wrong thing to do, because we didn't realize that, first of all, conditions are temporary, and most of the conditions we put in place were done away with by the next administration. And they didn't fundamentally address the real market structure issues that we needed to deal with. The other thing the new commission has to deal with is process and procedure, particularly the way the commission is lobbied. It is almost embarrassing sometimes when you try to figure out how a rulemaking goes from notice of inquiry to final rule. There is a culture of politicization at the agency that has gone on for many, many years that really has to change. And I think fundamentally it has to change through real procedural changes. Phil Weiser wrote a great article, I don't know if it was distributed here, about using more fact-finding at the agency. I don't know, maybe you talked about it earlier, using ALJs and even commissioners to bring folks in and cross-examine them as witnesses instead of the agency relying only on a paper record, when everybody knows that those comments are just the opening gambit that folks proffer in a rulemaking proceeding. And they know that the real negotiation is going to take place right before sunshine and sometimes afterwards. So that really needs to change in a fundamental way, and it should change in the beginning. The other opportunity the next chair will have is an opportunity to really rebuild the professional staff at the FCC. I stay in touch with a lot of people at the agency, and I get calls from just about everybody, it seems, when they're leaving, seeking advice. And it pains me to see the talent that's walked out the door in the last few years. I think we have a demoralized staff at the FCC. And the institutional staff at that agency is the heart and soul of the agency. And all they want is leadership. Believe me, those folks are the hardest working, most loyal people I've worked with in my life. And to see those folks walk out the door, when a Bob Pepper walks out the door, or Mary Beth Richards, or Bill Johnson, they're irreplaceable at some level. And a lot of thought has to be given to making the FCC a place where people really want to come and spend their careers. I think Michael Powell did a lot. He focused a lot on that with FCC University and trying to create an environment where people would come to the agency and learn. Reed did that with his program and bringing in a number of MBAs, trying to make the FCC a place where people from the business community could come and start their careers before going off to private equity or hedge funds or wherever. Although now they probably want to go back to the FCC if you're in a hedge fund. The appointment process, I'll say a couple of words on that, and then I want to open this up to some questions. Every time there's a turnover in an administration and some seats open up at the FCC, there is an opportunity to sort of restaff the agency at the highest levels. And I would hope that this go-round, President Obama will give deep thought, I'm sure he is, to thinking about the FCC as sort of a holistic team when we go out and buy a company, you have to think about it in terms of what is the management team going to look like as a leadership team. What are the strengths and weaknesses? And if you've got a chairman with certain strengths, you want other people who can shore him or her up. And there has to be much more emphasis in bringing people in, not only at the commissioner level, but throughout the agency with different skill sets. We need technologists, we need more economists, we need people who've been in the business world. When I think back to what I've learned in the last 8 years as an investor, I just wish I had known it as chairman, really understanding how a balance sheet should look, because people come and try to blow smoke at you. And when you really understand how the business world works, it really makes a difference. And we have an opportunity now to bring in some folks who don't just come from Washington, but if they've been here, they spent some time in the business world and have learned some very useful things. The other opportunity the next chair has is the changes on the Hill. There's a new leadership team up there now, with Senator Rockefeller taking over Commerce and Congressman Waxman taking over Commerce on the House side. That is a huge opportunity for the next chair to really build on those relationships anew, because there is a tendency for folks on the Hill to look at the FCC just sort of as a technical advisor on legislation, and sort of stay out of the policy. We'll manage that, but you just tell us if the subsections are ordered properly. That's really wrong. It's a wrong view of the world. There's so much expertise at the FCC, and there's an opportunity for the next chair to meet early on with those leaders in Congress and really bring to them a vision of how the FCC should look going forward, and the industry and the market structure should look going forward. The other thing that is really pains me to see sometimes is when proceedings that I worked on 8 or 10 years ago are still kicking around at the agency. There is a culture of what I call it hot potato. You get a hot potato issue and you just kick it to the next team. Whether it's intercarrier compensation or media ownership, and these issues are hard, but we've got to instill a culture in the agency of just bringing things to conclusion, getting things done. So there are great opportunities, obviously great challenges ahead. It's always easier to talk about these things theoretically, but I do think that it is a unique time because a lot of really important components are coming together in this new government, which I think are going to create great opportunity. Thank you.
So we've got some questions, but feel free to keep writing them down and following them through. Let me have one that picks up on a point neither of you addressed. But in the 70s, we talked about the Office of Telecommunications policy that Clay Whitehead led has helped provide some executive branch leadership. In the 90s, obviously, with Vice President Gore, there's a lot of executive branch leadership. As you think about the FCC, what's the right role for White House leadership to help interface with and support and even, in some case, guide its mission?
Well, first and foremost, you need somebody up there who cares about what the agency does. And it made a huge difference during my tenure to know that Vice President Gore really cared about the FCC and cared about the industry and the sector that we dealt with. And it's of great help to a chairman, because whenever there was a question about, I guess I can talk about this now, but whenever there were issues when I didn't think that I could get the right alignment on the commission to get something done, I always knew that I could get help from Al Gore and the people around him, and that was a wonderful thing to have. And as I've observed the commission, and admittedly I'm a lot more distant from it now. I don't monitor the machinations over there day to day like a lot of people in this room do, but I do see that we have in the Bush administration folks that the FCC is not on their radar screen, not even remotely so, and I think that makes it a lot more difficult for the agency to get things done.
I think it's really important for the next administration to figure out how it is going to work with the independent agencies. It's an important thing to be done in accordance with the requirements of law, but there's one position that I think would be ill-advised for the next administration to take, and that is the perspective, the extreme perspective that there's something wrong with the executive branch working with the independent agencies at all. Phil, Gigi, that's not what the law says. And if you're transparent about how you're going to coordinate and what you're going to talk about, then you can actually go about the business. Because the government, God bless our framers, but they designed a government that was intended to limit the exercise of government power, and it does too good a job at that today. And so what happens, and we're seeing this right now, is that when we get to moments of emergency, well, then we just don't pay any attention to the normal processes. And so the Treasury Secretary and the head of the Fed go to Congress and say, well, you've got 24 hours to decide to give us this money, and there's no oversight, and there are no rules, and there's no discussion, and there's no protocols, and we will never necessarily tell you what we did, and when we hire outside contractors, we won't reveal what we pay them, or who they are, or what their jobs are. And that's Treasury. Fed is even more secretive. Now, you can say many things about that, but it is not going to be the case that that approach, in my judgment, will be acceptable to the American people for the next 4 years as a way of dealing with major issues. So similarly, and this is totally consistent with the very wise remarks of my friend Bill, similarly, the FCC is going to need to be much more open about what it's trying to do and how it's trying to do it. We all know from personal experience that it just doesn't work well when you feel your principal communication with the decision maker at the FCC is some informal chit-chat that is recorded in an oblique manner in some filing, and yet you feel like, well, that was the only way that he or she was able and willing to take the information, and so that was how we had to get the information to them. But it doesn't work for anyone, because you don't have a shared view about what the facts are. You don't have any way for others to tell you that the facts are not what they are said to be. It doesn't work for anyone. It doesn't produce good results. So similarly, whatever the FCC is trying to accomplish ought to be transparent to the executive branch, and whatever the executive branch wants to accomplish ought to be able to be communicated to the FCC. You all can help here. Figure out what you think is the right protocol. Tell everybody. We know this, that the system that has operated for the last several years, it hasn't been good for the FCC chair, it hasn't been good for the commissioners, it hasn't been good for the executive branch, and it definitely hasn't been good for the country.
One of the things Bill, did you want to?
I would just build on that by reminding folks of something that Reed put in place, which I continued during my tenure. Every January, he would do a sort of State of the FCC, State of the Union address, which was, in effect, a strategic plan for the agency for the year ahead. And Kathy and I did that as well when I was there. I found it liberating because you would put down in a document, this is what we're going to do this year, quarter by quarter, just like a business would. And it did eliminate some of the gaming that I've seen go on at the FCC, because now there's no way to predict when an item is going to be brought before the commission. And so there's a lot of gaming going on. Lobbyists who don't like the item, they lobby against it, they go up to the Hill, they get letters to kill it, and people who want to accelerate things do the opposite. And this really goes to transparency. Just tell the people what are your priorities, what you want to get done, and when. It's pretty simple. But the agency has gotten away from aspiring to do that, and I think that's very dangerous.
I just want to shift the next question a little bit, the conversation about, we haven't really talked much about international policy and what the FCC's or the administration's role should be in leading technology policy around the world. I mean, the Clinton administration had its framework for global e-commerce. Seems that in this past administration, we really haven't had much leadership in this field internationally. So I want to ask both of you, what should the FCC's role be? What should the role of the administration and the executive branch be in leading policy debates on an international scale? And what should they be?
There was an article in the New York Times today by John Yoo and John Bolton. John Bolton, my law school classmate. The article is about how the next administration should have to comply with the treaty clause, which means getting a supermajority in the Senate and means taking international agreements only to the Senate and not to the House. This article is, in my judgment, completely wrong and a crass attempt to manipulate the fortunately reduced Republican minority into a position of power on international agreements. And in fact, it's rebutted by a brilliant article in the Yale Law Journal, where you and Bolton both went, that came out last year, that said that the right going forward mechanism is congressional executive agreement, meaning agreements that have to obtain a majority in the House and the Senate, but not a supermajority and not just in the Senate. Well, why take you there? Because the FCC actually does those agreements in the communications sector, congressional executive agreements. It is empowered to do it by Congress. Sometimes it can come up with such agreements, and they can apply to a broad range of things. They can be done, as was the case in the telecom annex to the WTO agreement in 1997. It was done through USTR, but it wasn't the Kyoto Treaty. It didn't have to get a 2/3 vote in the Senate. What are topics for international accord in the communications sector? You know, first you have to decide that you care about it, which I think, you know, is there's an incredibly important economic case. Again, to get back to exports, American tech firms and American media firms actually very much should be able to export more and in more countries, and they find numerous non-tariff barriers and network-based barriers everywhere that they try to go, particularly in China. So whether it's country by country or regional or global is a important tactical issue, which we won't go into right now. But the main point is the telecom deal of '97 was mostly about voice. We have no deal like that about data globally. Number two, we don't have an effective deal that protects IPR in the communications and media sector on a global level. Third, we don't have a policy of making sure that non-tariff barriers, i.e. standards barriers, are not being used by other countries to bar American products. Those are just three huge topics. The FCC wouldn't want to be the only agency trying to explore them, but there's plenty of opportunity for coordination. Of course, the starting point is you have to make sure you don't start out with the obstructionism that Bolton and you were trying to lay out today.
Bill?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think probably the best example of the FCC being proactive with other agencies which share jurisdiction for international affairs and agreements is the WTO annexation on basic telecoms. When Reed and Charlene Barshevsky, who was then head of USTR, traveled around the world, literally proselytizing for open markets and reform in the telecom sector. As I have been around the world looking for investment opportunities in recent years, there is a vacuum of leadership from the U.S. on these issues. And there is really no one that the business community can go to and know that you'll have a consistent advocate for creating really pro-investment conditions, particularly in the developing world. When I was there, I set up a development agenda where we actually signed agreements with developing countries to try to reform their regulatory systems. That was a great program. We were just getting it started, and it's gone now. And it makes a huge difference when you are investing capital. The first place you look in our sector is what is the regulatory framework and which jurisdictions are friendly to foreign investment and capital investment. It's real easy. And not having the U.S. government play a central role in being a voice for business is really tragic, and that needs to change.
Well, we could go on probably all day, but we won't. Instead, we're going to take this online. We have a website we're setting up.
www.fcc-reform.org, and it will be up later today. You'll all be getting email about it.
And we'll link to it from both the Silicon Flatirons and Public Knowledge websites. We very much appreciate your attendance and want to keep this discussion going. Thank you to our keynote speakers and our participators. It was really a wonderful event.
Thank you.